Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean, by providence impoverished and squalor. Grow up to be a hero and a scholar. The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter.
All right, well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. That lead-in song you might recognize if you've seen the hit Broadway show Hamilton. A really fantastic show. Recommend you see it if you haven't seen it yet. And it does a really good job of following the history of Hamilton, of the other founding fathers surrounding him, his impact on our country, what he was able to contribute. It's also very entertaining. It was the first musical that really used the rap genre as a way to deliver the messages and the history that he was trying to tell. Mr. Miranda, who was the founder of that show. He also, in collaborating to create the show about Hamilton, collaborated with Ron Chernow, who did the great book on Alexander Hamilton. Also recommend you read his book as well. So welcome to this new episode about Alexander Hamilton this week. Very excited to bring this to you. Done a lot of research, and we'll be bringing you today a bio of his background, as we always do. We'll also be talking about 3 very short videos, and we'll come back after each one and talk about each of them. And then I will be doing, as always, our 25 little-known facts that we always do in every program, and that'll be a real interesting and good review there to make you want to try to dive into Alexander Hamilton a little bit more and learn more about this important founding father. So let's go ahead and start with his background and his bio. He was born in the Caribbean island of Nevis, which is actually in the British West Indies. There's some question as to when he was born. It was either 1755 or 1757. And we'll get into a little bit later why there is some question about which year he was born in. He was born to a father who was a Scottish trader. His name was James Hamilton. His mother was Rachel Fawcett Levian. And his mother actually at the time was not divorced yet, had been married to a different man who had mistreated her and who had spent her family fortune. She had left him. And so a lot of people referred to Alexander Hamilton as a bastard son because he was born out of wedlock. He actually, his father left him when he was 9 years old. It's in 1766. And his mother died 2 years later. So essentially at 10 years old, he found himself to be an orphan in the West Indies. So maybe about as difficult a start as you could get back then in the colonies. Poor, without parents, and really probably didn't have much of a chance for a future, except that this young man had a lot of drive and a lot of spirit about him. So when he was 11, he actually took up a job at a trading company at 11 years old in St. Croix. He had only had 2 years of education at this point. He then gained wider attention when he published an eloquent letter describing a hurricane that had hit the island in 1772. And for some reason, this letter in today's world would go viral. But back then, this letter was picked up by many publications, including on the mainland United States. And he got some notoriety from that. Locals helped him raise money to get money together to go study in the United States after he wrote this letter and got some notoriety. And he ended up going to New York City. He arrived in New York in 1772. The colonies were actually at the time starting to gear up for independence and war with England. He got swept up a little bit in that when he came to New York City to become a student. He went to study at King's College in New York City, which is now called Columbia University. He was a very fast student. He had been an avid reader as a young man, and even though he had grown up in the West Indies, had always studied the classics and learned languages and been well-read for a young man with very little education. He eventually started picking up the colonial cause as a college student and started organizing other students to gather to talk about what's happening, do political discussions in local pubs. He even started drilling with local drill masters and getting some of his friends together and forming a militia right there on the King's College campus. When the Revolutionary War began, he was ready to join and actually joined as a commissioned soldier. He joined the Continental Army and was one of the main young soldiers that Washington started to recognize as a leader, George Washington. And he actually was promoted twice within his first 2 years of joining the Continental Army. He actually fought bravely at the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which were two of the major battles up north at that time during the Revolutionary War. By 1777, he had captured full attention of the Army's commander-in-chief, George Washington, and all of his military brass. And actually, George Washington then in 1777 gave him a position on his staff, which was a huge honor. So you can imagine this boy from the West Indies, orphaned, and came to this country, and all of a sudden, several years later, finds himself an officer on George Washington's staff. His writing prowess and military skills both helped him thrive in this new role on Washington's staff, and Washington then named him as his aide-de-camp, kind of like his right-hand man. He would always be found at all these times right around Washington, helping him strategize, helping him go over maps, helping him write correspondence back and forth to others in the field. So he really, a lot of the skills that he had gained early on as a boy really came to help him as an officer in the Continental Army. In 1780, he married Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of a wealthy and influential New York landowner. This was back then a very popular way to try to get yourself into a very well-bred family and get yourself on the path to wealth and prominence. They actually ended up having 8 children together, many of whom went on to have celebrated careers in law. 2 of them became judges. Some of them went into politics and even into the military. So he was very fortunate that all 8 of his children really did turn out very well and actually came to prominence in later generations. Elizabeth was always a huge source of comfort for him. She was his rock. She was incredibly loyal. She always proposed and promoted him to everybody else in the New York society and really in society in general. One interesting fact about Alexander Hamilton, his first son's name was Philip, and he was a very curious and intelligent boy, and they had a lot of high hopes for him. He actually ended up dying in a duel, very similar to how his father, Alexander Hamilton, died later. But in 1801, Philip Hamilton, at 19 years old, was in a duel trying to defend his father's honor and died in New Jersey, very close to the spot where 3 years later his father would die in a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. So we'll get into some of the details of that, but a very sad and curious situation that he died very similar to the way his father would 3 years later, both in a duel. By the way, duels back then were illegal, and so both of them were doing what was a traditional thing to defend someone's honor, but it was actually illegal to do. Interestingly enough, their 8th child together that they had, they named Philip after his older brother who had died in the duel. So in between those 3 years, when they both died in the duel, he had a young son named Philip again, named in honor of his older brother, who he never met. Hamilton then left Washington's staff in 1781 after the war. He returned to the Army briefly that year, and he did get a field command and was brought back into Washington's fold. They figured out they needed him and couldn't really let him retire yet. So they brought him back in to be the decisive commander at the Battle of Yorktown to end the war. And so Hamilton made a real name there by helping the final charge on Yorktown to make the British surrender their arms and effectively end the war at the time. In Hamilton's day, really courage was measured by, back then, whether you had battle experience, whether you had military experience, or whether you showed some type of leadership role. And so Hamilton had all those things in spades with his military experience and valor. He also was quite a genius. People at the time knew that Hamilton was one of the smartest of the founding fathers, and they would go to him for any kind of opinion you could get. As we'll talk a little bit later, he and Jefferson were close friends and confidants, but they also were at loggerheads and very much disagree with each other on the approach that they wanted to create for the new country. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was a Federalist. He was very much for a strong central government, for a central bank, for the ability for the new country to be able to get credit and to be able to borrow money, to be able to develop, have economic development occur because of that. So that's where he stood on that side of things. Jefferson stood much more on the side of states' rights, making sure the state governments were strong and the federal government was weak. And the federal government only took up the important things that the state governments could not, like a federal army, a post office, very small, simple aspects to the federal government. So these two great men, they respected each other, they liked each other, and they were friends, but they very much disagreed throughout their political lives on the direction of the new country. I think in a lot of ways, we're still dealing with those disagreements today. We still have very much in one party a view that a strong central government is the way to go, and we have another party that is very much for distribution of power to avoid tyranny. So it's interesting that we're still having that debate 250 years later. In addition, Hamilton was always sensitive about his very humble roots in the West Indies. He was always sensitive to that fact, and he was always trying to make up for that and trying to prove himself in the new country. And so a lot of his actions and things that he did later on were to try to make up for his humble beginnings, unlike the other founding fathers. In some ways, you could call him the most unlikely of the founding fathers. All the others were born into prominent families, on prominent farms, had pretty good upbringings, had good situations that they came up with, at least some education. But Hamilton, of course, had the longest road to go to get to prominence like he did. Hamilton also, I would mention, it was, of the founding fathers, one of the biggest patriots. You could consider him among the ones with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin. You really would consider those the top 5 patriots at that time. And so he was very much for the new country. He was very much for our independence and for our formation and the growth that we've achieved all the way up until today. One thing I've mentioned is that even though he didn't spend a lot of his time as a politician in his life, he did do a lot of work at the Continental Congress on the U.S. Constitution. He had a huge role and hand in that, and was with the James Madison and George Washington, John Adams. He was right there at the right side of that entire group that was putting the Constitution together. Again, trying to help counterbalance the strong federal government with the rights of the states so that we could find a good, happy medium between those things. Last thing I would mention is that since he was the leader of the Federalist Revolution at that time, he was the key author of the Federalist Papers, which were a series of essays published in the newspapers that were supporting the passage and ratification of the new U.S. Constitution among the 13 colonies. And if you read those Federalist Papers, he wrote about 2/3 of them. So he was the primary author, along with James Madison and John Jay. And we'll get into some more about that. So that's a little bit about the bio and background of Alexander Hamilton, a great man and a huge contribution to our country. First Secretary of the Treasury, founder of the central bank, the Federalist leader, and many, many more things that he contributed to the country. So we're going to go ahead and get into our first video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
Alexander Hamilton was a lawyer, soldier, statesman, and the first Secretary of the Treasury.
Alexander Hamilton was one of the strongest proponents that we had among the founding fathers for what's called a federalist form of government, which involves a very strong centralized government.
Alexander Hamilton was born between 1755 and 1757 in the British West Indies. The product of an adulterous affair, he was abandoned by his father in 1766 and grew up without privilege.
He came to the mainland colonies in 1773 and soon enrolled in what was then King's College, what is now Columbia University.
New York at the time was a hotbed of contending political factions. He soon found out that what was much more interesting was to become involved in this political strife, and he published his first piece of writing very soon afterwards, which he signed as a friend of America.
When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Hamilton left college to join in the fight, and by 1777, he was a lieutenant colonel and aide-de-camp to General George Washington. While still in the Army, Hamilton married Elizabeth Schuyler, daughter of the rich and powerful General Philip Schuyler.
After the American Revolution, Alexander Hamilton worked as a lawyer in New York.
Hamilton joined the Continental Congress and in 1787 was a New York delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. There he fought to replace the flawed Articles of Confederation with a constitution that guaranteed a strong central government.
He was actually the architect and author of the majority of what became known as the Federalist Papers. 85 different articles published in newspapers that were designed to convince the states to ratify the U.S. Constitution.
When George Washington was elected America's first president in 1789, he tapped Alexander Hamilton to be the first Secretary of the Treasury.
Alexander Hamilton designed the Treasury Department. He believed that it was the role of the federal government to collect and disperse money. At the same time, he was fervent about paying down the national debt.
Hamilton laid out a plan for how a national economy could actually emerge at a time when many people didn't know how it could possibly work.
In 1795, Hamilton stepped down as Secretary of the Treasury, leaving behind a more secure U.S. economy. Hamilton returned to his law practice, but remained involved in politics. His support of Thomas Jefferson in the heated 1800 presidential election secured Jefferson's victory over Aaron Burr. For Burr, this marked the first of many perceived slights by Hamilton.
On July 11, 1804, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr met on the dueling grounds of Weehawken, New Jersey, which was really the end of a long-standing political feud and personal feud between these two men.
Hamilton didn't shoot at him, basically said, "This is ridiculous, I'm just going to shoot in the air." And then Burr levels his gun and shoots at him. It makes Burr seem like a lesser man.
Alexander Hamilton died the next day in New York City on July 12, 1804. Today, he is remembered for establishing the federal principles of national government and is the face of the $10 bill.
All right, so many things out of that video we should talk about. First one being we never would have had the federal government we have without Alexander Hamilton being the strong force behind it. And the reason to have the federal government, the reason to have the central bank, the Federal Reserve, to have a stable currency, to have the ability to borrow as a country and to be able to support all the things we wanted to do with our military and our government in general. So clearly he was the driving force behind that and the whole Federalist movement. In addition, wanted to mention, you heard some of the skills he had there in his life. He was an excellent writer, one of the best writers. He and Jefferson, probably the two best, along with Madison. And so he wrote a lot of important letters, documents, articles, and even pieces of the Constitution itself. So a very important contribution there. Another thing I'd mention, in his private life, he was an excellent lawyer, one of the best trial lawyers in New York and New York City, and won a lot of cases on behalf of his clients. So he had a real good reputation there as well. Obviously, the sad thing, the demise in 1804 in the duel against Aaron Burr, you can see he even did the honorable thing. Even during the duel, he shot in the air instead of at Aaron Burr, whereas Aaron Burr shot at him. That was the culmination of a very long feud between the two of them, culminating in Alexander Hamilton supporting Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800, which was a big surprise since Burr and Alexander Hamilton were in the same party. And you would have thought he would have supported Burr, but he just despised Burr and didn't want him to be president. So he ended up supporting his political opponent, the man that they had had disagreements with for many, many years over states' rights versus federal rights. But he thought Jefferson would make a better president, so he supported him and took him over the top. So really honorable thing that he did there. And then his legacy still lives in so many different ways today. We wouldn't have had the Treasury we have. We wouldn't have had the currency that we have with the dollar. And there's so many different things that he contributed that we still have impact today. Wall Street wouldn't be the way it was. So you can see out of that video lots of little tidbits there that you can dig into if you're more interested in Hamilton going forward. Well, let's take a look at our second video, and we'll come back after that one.
I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in a federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
Well, sadly, that is very well said. But there can be no question. Our nation cannot bind together without powerful central government. But we must also accommodate the needs of our constituent states, both North and South. Now, the power of one must check and balance the other. And to that end, we must dedicate all of our energies and our care.
I would like to welcome Mr. Jefferson home. Mr. Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Mr. President, gentlemen.
So you can see in that really great scene from HBO's John Adams series, the interchange and the interplay between Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And you can really see these two brilliant men going at each other in a very respectful way. They liked each other, they were friends, but they also were political rivals. Alexander Hamilton on one side making the very good argument that a country can't be a country unless it can borrow money and it can put a government together, it can pay for services, pay for a military, and be able to build its economy. Really, for him, it was all about the economy. He wanted to be able to develop the country. And you can see the very real concerns on the other side with Jefferson and the states' rights issues he was talking about, especially when he was thinking about the South, because his fear was that you'd have a concentrated federal government up north where all the money and prestige and power would be, to the detriment of the southern states. And of course, that concern came out in a real big way in our Civil War many years later. So this was the friction that was happening. And I believe that we wouldn't have had as great an experiment called America without all of these great minds the friction, the interchange, and the kind of the compromises that we came to in the middle among all these different philosophies. It's a really interesting interchange there. You also saw on the scene John Adams trying to broker between this Federalist and states' rights way of thinking. You saw also George Washington in the scene is very quiet, and that's how he was. He was kind of the quiet, stoic leader type who would listen and every once in a while pipe in with his opinion as well. So these were the great founders. These were the men that shaped the country, and obviously Hamilton was a huge part of that. So let's go ahead back to our third video, and we'll come back after this. This is going to be a little preview of the great Broadway show Hamilton. It's an excellent musical. Again, I'd highly recommend you check it out sometime. And here's a little preview of that and how it came about.
This is a story of someone who wrote his way out of his circumstances and then wrote his way to self-destruction. I thought, this is Tupac. This is Biggie. This is a hip-hop story. This is my next show.
The $10 founding father without a father got a lot.
Alexander Hamilton is one of the unsung heroes of our country.
He was a brilliant man and a daring man who had a vision.
Hamilton had the core idea about an aggressive role for government that enriches us all.
Well, the word got around.
Mr. President.
Hey, man. When you told us, I'm going to do a rap about Alexander Hamilton, we said, well, good luck with that.
Hamilton has this incredible drive, this incredible inventiveness. He's so relentless. It forces you to reckon with, well, what am I doing with my life? So I'm writing as fast as I can. Right now, I'm working on the second song in the show. I haven't figured out how it works yet.
It's rare that you do a show where you have so many places that you can visit.
Can I touch the desk? No, okay, I won't.
Hamilton's an interesting, self-destructive, lightning rod of a character.
Hamilton had the first major sex scandal.
This is like a soap opera. You can't make this stuff up.
In hip-hop, no one can tell you you're wrong unless the rhymes are whack.
Alexander Hamilton is somewhere going, I created what money is in the bank systems. I got no thanks for that?
I feel like Hamilton reached out from history and wouldn't let me go until I told his story.
She named him Alexander Hamilton.
So you can see it's really a fantastic show that Miranda created with Ron Chernow's assistance and all of the many, many talents he's got in that show and has had in the show for many, many years. Actually have seen the show here in Charlotte, North Carolina when it came here to the Blumenthal Theater. Highly recommended. It's very explosive. It's really interesting. Music's great. All the lyrics are fantastic. If you listen to them carefully and you learn a lot about history, you see really the interplay between Hamilton and the other founding fathers. And it's a very exciting show. Highly recommended. So hope you enjoyed that. Let's go ahead to our favorite segment of the show that we do every week, and that is our 25 little known facts about Alexander Hamilton. And then we'll talk about that on the other side. All right, number one, Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean islands, but we're not exactly sure when. We mentioned this a little bit earlier. Hamilton was born in Charlestown, the capital of Nevis, a tiny island in the British West Indies. His birthday was definitely on January 11th, but the year is up for debate. Hamilton always claimed he was born in 1757, but Nevisian records cite 1755. According to Ron Chernow, who's the biographer we mentioned who wrote the book on Hamilton, it's possible Hamilton pretended or even lied to be younger to seem more impressive when applying to King's College. He was born in 1755. It would have meant he would have started college at 18 years old, which, believe it or not, that's considered very old at that time. Most college attendees back in those times would go to school at 14 or 15 years old. Of course, today we go to college at 18, but again, he might have lied just to make it seem like he was going to college at the right age. Number two of Alexander Hamilton's children were named Philip. We mentioned this a little earlier. His first son, Philip, who grew up to be smart, quick-tempered, and fiercely loyal to his father, and after several tense run-ins with George Eaker, a well-known lawyer who had insulted Alexander's speech, 19-year-old Philip challenged him to a duel. Eaker's bullet caught Philip in the hip, and he died the next day. The Hamilton's eighth and youngest child was born just a year after the tragedy, and they named him Philip in honor of his brother that he'd never know. And you'll see there on the left, the younger looking one was Philip I, who died in the duel. And then the one on the right is actually the younger Philip, the eighth child, who grew up to be a very prominent lawyer in New York and actually ended up going to the bench as well. So became a very prominent man. Number 3, Alexander Hamilton was close friends with his wife's sister, Angelica. And as in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical suggests, Hamilton was indeed close friends with his wife's older sister, Angelica. They frequently exchanged affectionate and flirtatious letters. Angelica did jokingly proposition her sister Eliza to share him with her, which was kind of scandalous at that time. I love him very much, and if you were as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a while, she wrote to Eliza in 1794. It's a little bit of a scandal there. Number 4, Alexander Hamilton's death after a duel with Aaron Burr was the culmination of a years-long rivalry. So his death was shocking, but it wasn't totally surprising since the two politicians had butted heads for many years over political issues and politics in general. They were both orphans and both graduated from King's College and both became lawyers, fought in the Revolutionary War together, but Hamilton was passionate and committed to his Federalist ideology. He used his influence to discredit Burr and bring about the defeat of Burr in the 1800 presidential election and also in 1804 in New York's gubernatorial election. So he literally spoiled Burr's chances in 2 different elections. Burr demanded an apology, and of course Hamilton, who's very stubborn, refused to give that apology. They eventually decided the only way to settle this issue was a duel, which was common back then. So on July 11th, 1804, Hamilton and Burr met at Weehawken, New Jersey. And ironically, this was only a couple hundred feet away from where Philip Hamilton was fatally shot 3 years earlier in his duel that we just talked about. So very ironic that they both died the same way, 3 years apart, only a couple hundred meters apart from each other. Alexander Hamilton's grave is in the Trinity Church Cemetery in Manhattan, New York. July 14th, 1804 was declared a day of mourning in New York City, and onlookers lined the sidewalks to watch Hamilton's funeral procession from Angelica and John Church's house on what now is Park Place to Trinity Church on Wall Street and Broadway. He was laid to rest in a grave that was later marked with a large, stately obelisk donated in 1806 by the Society of the Cincinnati, which was a patriotic group in which Hamilton was president general before his death. When Eliza Hamilton died in 1854, you can see she outlived him by 48 years. She was buried directly in front of her husband's grave. Alexander Hamilton's wife, Elizabeth Eliza, she helped establish his legacy. She was fiercely loyal, and she was very much a proponent of his career and everything that he had achieved. So after he died, she and a number of other women founded the Orphan Asylum Society, New York's first private orphanage, which had always been a goal of Alexander's to help orphans and to form orphanages to help those orphans. Obviously, he was an orphan, and so he felt very strongly about their cause. In addition to their philanthropic endeavors, Eliza was instrumental in cementing his legacy. She made sure he got credit as the main author of Washington's farewell address. She also attended a post-constitutional gathering and went on his behalf to make sure he was given credit for what he had done for the U.S. Constitution formation. She helped create a collection of his writings, which were edited by her son, John Church Hamilton, and were published after his death and became one of the largest selling volumes at the time. Number 7, Alexander Hamilton never actually ran for president. So unlike all the other very ambitious founders, he didn't run. He had had such an integral role in founding America, including landing himself on the $10 bill because of the formation of the Federal Reserve and his position as Secretary of the Treasury. He did not want to contest George Washington at the time. George Washington was larger than life in the colonies at that time. And as we know, George Washington won unanimously for his first 2 presidential terms, and then he stepped back from politics and could have had additional terms, but decided not to. So after he left office, 1796, John Adams won. John Adams had been George Washington's vice president. And then as the 1800 election rolled around, Hamilton was considering running against Thomas Jefferson, but had had a highly publicized affair with Maria Reynolds, which seriously damaged his reputation in the newspapers at the time. He decided to pull his name out of contention for the 1800 election. And for 1804, of course, he died in 1804 due to the duel with Aaron Burr. So just under circumstances, he was never given the chance or had the chance due to circumstances to run for president. Number 8, Alexander Hamilton was not allowed to attend school. So his parents were never married, as we mentioned earlier. Because of this, Hamilton was barred from attending any schools in the British West Indies due to his illegitimacy. So he was privately educated by a tutor, and he also pored over his family's collection of books and classics and was self-taught in many ways, very similar to the way Ben Franklin self-taught himself. He remained an avid reader and writer after he was orphaned by his father. And he eventually, that avid reading and scholarship on his own behalf ended up taking him to New York City, as you know, and going to college and having a very successful career. At his death, he had one of the largest libraries in New York City, and that library ended up getting donated to the City of New York City's library. Number 9, Alexander Hamilton dabbled in poetry. You can see one of the poems that he wrote up top there called In the Wind. On August 31st, 1772, a hurricane ravaged St. Croix, and teenage Hamilton, who had been working on the island as a clerk, described the disaster in a letter that was eventually published in the Royal Danish American Gazette writing. It seemed as if total dissolution of nature was taking place, he said. His words changed his life forever. Blown away by the letter, readers organized a scholarship fund for this young, talented scribe. That scholarship fund, of course, then took him to New York City, where he attended King's College, now Columbia University. Number 10, the oldest unit in the United States Army is Hamilton's unit that he was in the Continental Army. It still exists today. According to the Army Historical Foundation, Battery D, 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery, 1st Infantry Division Mechanized. It traces its lineage back to Hamilton's Revolutionary War Artillery Company and is the oldest serving unit in the regular Army. March 1776, Hamilton was made captain of that group, and under its leadership, it saw action in several big skirmishes, including battles of White Plains and Princeton. Impressed by the young man's valor, George Washington made Hamilton his aide-de-camp, which was really the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1777. Number 11, Alexander Hamilton wasn't satisfied as aide-de-camp. So even though he had achieved that rank and it was a big honor from Washington, he over the next couple of years was made it very clear that he wanted more than that. And as time went by, he retired of essentially serving as a high-status clerk to Washington. In 1781, the aide-de-camp resigned from Washington's inner circle. And then afterward, Hamilton was put in charge of a new battalion and pulled off an impressive night attack against British forces at the decisive Battle of Yorktown. You can see a picture there of Hamilton leading his troops over the wall to take out the British in the final battle of the war. Number 12, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr occasionally collaborated. So before they had their political feud and eventually their duel that ended in Alexander Hamilton's death, they were two of the city's top lawyers in New York City and sometimes would work together on different clients and cases. There actually was one particular case in 1800 where he was assigned to a murder trial and brought Aaron Burr on to help him with the case. And they actually ended up winning that case together. So you can see they were able to work together at some times. Alexander Hamilton supported Vermont's statehood, number 13. So pre-revolution, New York and New Hampshire both tried to claim the area that would become the state of Vermont. In 1764, King George III decreed that everything west of the Connecticut River belonged to New York. In 1777, during the American Revolution, Vermont petitioned the Continental Congress to acknowledge its sovereignty as a new state. Thanks to opposition from New York's delegates, however, this didn't happen at that time. And for the next 14 years, Vermont unable to join the Union on its own terms, existed as an independent republic, very similar to the way Texas was. In the end, Hamilton was able to spearhead a settlement between New York and Vermont. With New York's approval and with a payment of $30,000 from Vermont to New York, Vermont finally entered the Union in 1791. So he was a big spearheaded portion of that effort. Number 14, it's believed Alexander Hamilton authored most of the Federalist Papers. Apart from his stint as America's first Secretary of the Treasury, the Federalist Papers are maybe his biggest political achievement, of which he's best known. They were published between 1787 and 1788. There were 85 essays which urged New York's electorate to ratify the recently proposed U.S. Constitution. The documents were originally written under various pseudonyms, and the one Hamilton used was Publius. That was his pseudonym at that time. Also, James Madison and John Jay would also contribute to the Federalist Papers at that time. Because none of them used their real names, we can't be absolutely certain how many papers each man wrote, but the general consensus among historians is that Hamilton wrote 51 of the 85, with Madison writing 29 and Jay writing 5. You can see a very famous quote from Hamilton in those papers, and there's lots of real good nuggets. If you have some time to work your way through the Federalist Papers, it's a good read. But this quote says, "We are now forming a republican government. Real liberty is neither found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy, but in moderate governments." So he was thinking along the same lines as the other founding fathers. How do we strike a balance between federalism and states' rights? How do we get to that perfect balance? Number 15, the last letter George Washington ever wrote was addressed to Alexander Hamilton. Of course, Hamilton had been very loyal to him as one of his officers, his aide-de-camp, his Secretary of the Treasury. These men had worked for a long time together, helped form the country as founding fathers. America's first president had sent a dispatch to his former aide and cabinet member. Hamilton had recently argued that a regular military academy should be established, and his old mentor praised the idea. In a 1799 letter that was Washington's last, the elder statesman told Hamilton such a place would be of primary importance to the country. Ironically, also, John Adams was a big proponent of this military academy. So eventually it did get done. And of course, we have the great military academy in New York, and then we have the Air Force Academy and a couple of others that have come along. Number 16, Alexander Hamilton's eldest son, Philip, also died in a duel. We mentioned this a little earlier, that 3 years earlier than the Aaron Burr Hamilton duel, his son Philip had died in 1801 at the hands of George Eaker. What actually happened in this incident was George Eaker had reportedly insinuated in a speech during a 4th of July that Alexander Hamilton might use his former position as Inspector General of the U.S. Army to try to intimidate political opponents, including Thomas Jefferson. And 19-year-old Philip was quite a hothead at the time. He took it upon himself to try to uphold his father's honor and challenged Eaker to a duel with deadly consequences. So he was trying to protect his father's reputation. 17, he was an immigrant of the United States, despite there being a dispute among historians on which year he was born. We do know that he was not born in the United States. Hamilton was born out of wedlock in the British West Indian colonies. There's a little map there of the British West Indies and what they looked like. And so, again, the unlikely story, the unlikely patriot, and the unlikely founding father coming from an immigrant status. Number 18, he was involved in the nation's first public sex scandal. We heard a little bit of that on the video about the Hamilton Broadway show. There was a supposed widow named Maria Reynolds who approached Hamilton and begged him for financial support. She played on his heartstrings by claiming her husband, James Reynolds, had abandoned her. Blinded by his sympathy and feelings for a strong attachment to Maria, Hamilton failed to realize Maria's sob story was actually an attempt to manipulate the then Secretary of the Treasury. After delivering monetary aid to Reynolds for the first time at the house where she was lodging, the two began an illicit affair that would last from 1792 all the way to 1797. In 1797, the scandal actually exploded after a reporter, Calendar, who was the same reporter that tried to bribe Thomas Jefferson, by the way. He printed the Reynolds-Hamilton affair letters in his paper, and Hamilton published his own lengthy pamphlet in which he acknowledged the extramarital relationship and apologized for it. Hamilton was then publicly applauded for his honesty, but his political career was effectively destroyed and over, and he did not end up running for the election in 1800. 19, he left his family in debt, very similar to many of the founding fathers when he left public office and towards the end of his life, he left his family in a very bad financial situation. Days before he died, his will explained his financial circumstances. And it said if any accident should happen to him, the things that they should do in his stead. He tied his public service to the present state of his finances, which included debts that would prove a burden to his family. In fact, the state of the debts prompted Eliza, his wife, to ask Congress for money and land that was given to him for his service in the Revolutionary War, but that he had previously forfeited out of honor. So those monies and land she asked to be returned to the family. Number 20, Hamilton's time as tax collector shaped his Federalist leanings. After his war service ended, he worked as a tax collector for the new federal government and saw that many New Yorkers didn't want to pay taxes to the federal government. They wanted to keep money in their own state. But the war wasn't over yet, and once it ended, the new nation would have to pay back that money it borrowed from many other countries to fund it. Hamilton knew this would be a problem. Some states weren't going to pay their fair share. So in 1787, he attended the Constitutional Convention, and he worked with other attendees to write the U.S. Constitution, which was the set of laws for which the country was to be governed. That would give more power to the federal government. And along those lines, he was thinking of his time as tax collector and what would happen in the future when the country needed money. Many of the delegates attending the conference did not like this. So Hamilton and two other leaders took upon themselves to write the 85 essays that were the Federalist Papers, explaining why it was important and why it was needed. They convinced delegates to sign the new Constitution and go back to their states to get it ratified. 21, Hamilton helped his arch rival Jefferson win the presidency in 1800. So the 1800 election started out Jefferson running against his old boss, John Adams, and then eventually came down to a duel between Burr and Jefferson. Went to Congress to be decided. Hamilton supported Jefferson over Burr, and he convinced several Federalists to switch their support to Jefferson, giving Jefferson a victory on the 36th ballot. Members actually stayed up 3 straight days until a decision was made. Jefferson became the second consecutive incumbent vice president to be elected. And you can see there what the final vote was at the end. You had 10 state delegations voted for Jefferson, 4 supported Burr, and 2 made no choice. They're pretty interesting. Number 22, Alexander Hamilton founded the New York Post, which still exists today. In 1801, the paper was originally known as the New York Evening Post, and you can see old copy of the original paper there. The founding father conceived his new publication as a megaphone for the anti-Jefferson Federalist Party, which he helped create. So during the Jefferson administration, even though he had gotten Jefferson elected, he spent much of his time those years opposing Jefferson and everything Jefferson stood for. He himself generated many of the Post's early editorials. He appoints a time when I may see him, said the editor, William Coleman. As soon as I see him, he begins in a deliberate manner to dictate to me, and I note down in shorthand. When he stops, my article is completed. It's a very interesting way that Hamilton was writing articles for his own newspaper. He would dictate to the editor, who would then write it down and put it into the paper. Number 23, Hamilton, as first Secretary of the Treasury, is on the current $10 bill. That honor, but he was not the first Treasurer of the United States. That honor went to Michael Hillegas, a wealthy Philadelphian who led the Treasury through the duration of the American Revolution. So before we actually had a country, we were trying to get our independence. The treasurer at that time was Michael Hillegas. His face was actually on an early version of the $10 bill before Hamilton's. So you can see Hillegas on the right there. That's the original $10 bill. And then on the left is the current $10 bill with Alexander Hamilton on it. 24, Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin are the only people on U.S. currency who were not presidents. So as founding fathers, both Alexander and Ben were considered so integral to our founding that exceptions were made to the presidential rule on currency. So pretty cool thing there that the two non-presidents who got on the currency were Hamilton and Franklin. 25, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton musical was based on the book Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. So I mentioned both of these things. I recommended to you that you see the show and that you read the book Alexander Hamilton. Miranda was struck by how much Hamilton's story sounded like a classic hip hop narrative, meaning that Hamilton, like the best hip hop artists, used his mastery of language to write his way out of poverty and obscurity. Miranda asked Chernow to be historical advisor for the musical, which he was forming. Chernow actually replied, "Does that mean I can tell you when something is wrong?" "Yes," said Miranda, "I want the historians to take this show seriously." And they definitely have, based on the fact that Chernow eventually then rapped an entire introductory track from the show during his keynote speech at Lafayette College's commencement in 2017. And so you can actually look that up. You can see Chernow doing what typically is done by Miranda in the show, which is a rap of that initial song. And it was pretty cool. You can look it up on YouTube and take a look at it. All right, well, that is the little known facts of Alexander Hamilton. I hope you enjoyed that. I always enjoy going through that with you and getting you thinking about the things that you might not know about one of our founding fathers. Maybe you weren't taught in school, little things that you can find if you do your extensive research. I'm hoping it also makes you want to kick into some activities around researching these founding fathers as we look at each one of them individually. So thank you so much for joining us today about Alexander Hamilton. And take a look at the show and continue to do your traveling through history. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.